nervous system can be categorized or described in different ways. Now, as anatomists, one way we describe it is, the best way we can describe it is as the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Then the central nervous system will include the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system will include the 12 pairs of cranial nerves and the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Plus, you can add to this the sympathetic chain, which is outside the central nervous system. You have the sympathetic chain. Then, there are certain sympathetic ganglia. Sympathetic and parasympathetic ganglia. Sympathetic ganglia are mainly the sympathetic chain, but there are at least parasympathetic ganglia outside on the wall of the organs or close to organs. So all these things can be classified under the peripheral nervous system. So then when you say central nervous system or peripheral nervous system, in the central nervous system, whether it's brain or whether it's the spinal cord, you have both types of nerves in that, somatic and autonomic. So this one will have somatic and autonomic nerves, and this one also will have somatic and autonomic nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so you can't have only one classification and finish off. You will have several classifications, and depending on the need, you will change it and use it. So then, when it comes to the central nervous system, in the central nervous system, we see the brain and the spinal cord are there. Spinal cord roughly starts from the level of the foramen magnum below. Then it is protected inside you have the vertebral column here. So inside the vertebral column, you have the vertebral canal. Each vertebra will have a vertebral foramen, and when all the vertebral foramina are put together, you will get a vertebral canal. Inside that, you get the spinal cord. Then the brain will be above the foramen magnum level. Above that level, you have the brain. So if you use these lines, red dotted lines, to show the skull and the vertebral column, this is how you see it. The brain is protected in the cranial cavity inside the skull, and the vertebral column is protected inside the vertebral canal, inside the vertebral column. So then, when they are inside the bony, the cranial cavity or the vertebral column, there are membranes in between the bone here and the brain, or in between the bone here and the spinal cord, to protect them. So these layers that protect them are called meninges. We will have a separate lecture on meninges tomorrow. So for the moment, get an idea about what meninges are. There are 3 layers of meninges. As you can see here, you have the skull here. Then immediately under the skull, you get the dura mater. Then the third layer is arachnoid mater. The second layer is arachnoid mater. The third layer is on the surface of the brain, which is called the pia mater, which you can't specifically see in this one. I'll show it like this. So if this is the brain and the spinal cord, dura mater is the outermost layer. If you draw the vault of the skull, it will be like this. Okay, outside. Inside, deep to the dura mater, you get the arachnoid mater. Then further deeply, you get the pia mater, and this pia mater is on the surface of the brain. If you want to separate, pia mater is on the surface of the brain and the spinal cord, both. If you want to separate it from the brain or the spinal cord, you will have to tear it from the surface of the central nervous system, brain or the spinal cord. Now, this pia mater, the arrangement of pia mater on the brain and spinal cord, should be understood the way you understand the arrangement of visceral pleura on the lung. Now, when if you have done the lungs, if you have the lung like this, you have the rib cage outside, and there's a parietal pleura attached to the rib cage. And similarly, there's a visceral pleura attached to the surface of the lung. To separate the visceral pleura from the surface of the lung, you have to tear it from the surface. Okay. So the pyometer is also like that. Okay, it's attached to the surface. Okay. Then inside the brain and also inside the spinal cord, there are cavities, and these are connected up. Now, what is inside the brain are called ventricles. They are called ventricles. There are several ventricles. We will discuss those ventricles towards the end of this lecture. Now, inside the ventricles, there's another layer of cells. There is a layer of cells lining the ventricular cavities, and this layer is called ependymal cell layer. Okay, and these cavities are filled with the fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Again, we will discuss that later. Now, coming back to the brain and its parts of the brain, this is how you describe the parts of the brain. Now, if you go by the development of the brain, you must have gone through the development of the brain already. Developmentally, you divide the brain into three main parts: the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. Now, according to that classification, forebrain will have two parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is the largest part. As a part, it is the largest part of the brain. We will come back to it later anyway. That is the cerebral hemisphere, the large part. And the number 2 is the diencephalon. Okay, the diencephalon hidden inside the large cerebral hemisphere. So together you call them the forebrain. Okay, it's formed by the forebrain vesicle during development. Then the midbrain is a fairly small part, as you can see here, fairly small part below the forebrain. Then the third one is the hindbrain, and the parts of the brain that comes under hindbrain are the pons, medulla, and the cerebellum. Pons, medulla, and the cerebellum. So this is a developmental based classification. Okay, that's why the cerebellum is with the pons and medulla. Usually cerebellum has a totally different function compared to pons and medulla. Rather, midbrain has functions together with the pons and medulla. So functionally and clinically, when it comes to clinical setup patients, this classification is not very helpful. Okay, so even though you have the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain concept, we don't use it very much because when you become clinicians, you don't need this classification so much. But this classification is more relevant, where you take the term cerebrum. Okay, instead of forebrain, you use the term cerebrum, and then the cerebrum will have the cerebral hemisphere and the diencephalon. Okay, cerebral hemisphere and the diencephalon. Then now instead of midbrain taking as a separate part, what you do is you take midbrain, pons, and medulla, all three together, and call it the brain stem. Okay, midbrain, pons, and medulla together and call it brain stem, because you have cardiac centers, respiratory centers, and you have this reticular formation, which is responsible for keeping the person awake. All these things are actually located along these all three structures. Okay, so therefore, rather than putting them into separate categories, you put them together and call it brainstem. So you will have brainstem diseases, you will have certain structures in the brainstem that you will learn together. Then the cerebellum in this classification is taken separately. It's fair enough because cerebellum has totally different coordinating function. Okay, so remember this classification. You have the cerebrum, then the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Now, when you take the cerebrum, as I said before, if you take as part, it is the largest part of the brain, and out of it, the cerebrum has two parts. I said the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. Out of the two, cerebral hemispheres are the very large parts. During development, they grow rapidly and cover the diencephalon totally. Therefore, the diencephalon is hidden inside the two cerebral hemispheres. For you to see the diencephalon, you have to cut the cerebral hemispheres in the middle and separate them out to two sides to see the diencephalon inside. We'll see that in a moment. Then the diencephalon, now you might wonder, what diencephalon is. It's none other than the thalamus and the hypothalamus taken together with two other structures. I'll get back to it again later. But the main two parts of the diencephalon are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay. Then if you take a mid-sagittal section of the brain, so you get two equal halves on either side. And if you look at one half from its medial side where it was cut in the middle, you see a picture like this. So this is the, in this case, is the right cerebral hemisphere. The right cerebral hemisphere. So we are referring to this cerebral hemisphere. Okay, right cerebral hemisphere, and you can also see the brain stem, midbrain, pons, and medulla cut, and you can also see the cerebellum cut here. Now, since we are discussing the cerebrum, it is above this line that we are discussing now, not below that. Okay. So above that line, you can see the cerebral hemisphere, right cerebral hemisphere, as I said before, and then you can see the diencephalon. Diencephalon, which constitute the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, when you put the other cerebral hemisphere on top of this is the picture you get. So it covers the diencephalon so that you don't see the diencephalon. Okay. So to see the diencephalon, you have to remove the other cerebral hemisphere. That is the point that I wanted to raise here. Then if you look at the cerebral hemisphere itself, part of the cerebrum, as a separate part, that is the largest again, you know, if you take it as a totally separate part. Then the two cerebral hemispheres are separated from each other by a mid-sagittal fissure called longitudinal cerebral fissure. Now, if you look from above, this is how you see the two cerebral hemispheres. One side is like that, then the other side is like this. Okay, so the longitudinal cerebral fissure is this one. Okay, so there's a fairly good gap between the two here, and this gap is filled by a layer of durameter, the outermost meninge, which is called the falx cerebri. Falx cerebri, separating this out in its upper part, not totally, because in the middle part you get the diencephalon here in the middle, which is in the center, so that the fissure cannot continue below that level, and the falx cerebri also will have to stop there. Okay. Then there's another structure called tentorium cerebelli, which separates the cerebral hemisphere from the cerebellum. Okay, we'll see how it happens. Now, this is how it happens. Now, this is a coronal section of the brain. You know what a coronal section is. You cut it like this, okay, across. Okay. Now, in a coronal section, this is how you see the durameter. Okay, so this is the durameter. You get the skull outside this. Then, this is falx cerebri. I said it's an extension of the durameter, and it passes into the longitudinal fissure. So this is this longitudinal cerebral fissure. And it gets, it does not go below a certain level, which is called corpus callosum, which lies above the thalami here in that area. Okay, the diencephalon is in this area. Okay, so even before the diencephalon, it is stopped by the corpus callosum, which is the connection, the main connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. We'll discuss that later. Now, in that same fissure, longitudinal fissure, you get two important arteries, which are called anterior cerebral arteries. When you do the blood supply of the brain, you will learn about the anterior cerebral arteries. So then that is about the falx cerebri, separating the two cerebral hemispheres. Then this is the tentorium cerebelli that separates the cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellum, I say. So what happens is this. If you take a sagittal section instead of a coronal section, this is how you see the cerebrum. This is how you see the cerebrum. Okay, cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon inside. Then this is how you see the cerebellum. Now this is tentorium cerebelli. Okay, this is tentorium cerebelli. Now it is again an extension of durameter, a horizontal extension. Okay, it's a horizontal extension in that direction, separating the cerebrum above from the cerebellum below. Okay, and your brainstem will pass from here to here like this through the tentorium cerebelli. I'll show you in a diagram. Then, to increase the surface area of the cerebral hemispheres, it has thrown into folds. Cerebral hemisphere has thrown into folds like this to increase the surface area of it. Then these elevations are called gyri, and these depressions or grooves are called sulci. Okay, so there are gyri and sulci. Okay, one after the other. Then there are several important sulci. There are many sulci, but some of the sulci are considered as main or important sulci. And these main sulci actually separate the cerebral hemisphere into several lobes. Okay, several lobes, and some of these sulci can be named as the central sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, lateral sulcus, and so on. Okay, now if you look on this brain, you can see now this is a sulcus or groove, then this is a gyrus, an elevated area. If you go into the details of main sulci and gyri, now this sulcus is called, which is in the center, is called central sulcus. And the central sulcus divides the cerebral hemisphere into a frontal lobe in front and a parietal lobe behind. Okay. Then there's another important sulcus called parieto-occipital sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe here. Occipital lobe here. And there's another sulcus called lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. Okay, so these three sulci actually separate the cerebral hemisphere into frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. And these names of the lobes are based on the bones of the cranial bones overlying them. Now, overlying the frontal bone is the frontal lobe is the frontal bone, and overlying the parietal bones is the parietal lobes is the parietal bones of the vault of the skull. Then overlying the occipital lobe, it is the occipital bone, and here you get the temporal bone of the skull. So it's totally based on the bones overlying the lobes. Okay, so you get frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. So if you look at the cranial cavity, if you have studied the cranial cavity, you will get an idea. Now this part of the cranial cavity, if you look from above, is called the anterior cranial fossa. Anterior cranial fossa. Okay, so that is this part, anterior cranial fossa. Then this area is called middle cranial fossa. Okay, so that is this area, middle cranial fossa. And this area is called posterior cranial fossa. So that is this one, posterior cranial fossa. So this is clear to you. Now in the anterior cranial fossa, it is the frontal lobe that lies in the anterior cranial fossa. This area you get the frontal lobe, and these two areas you get the temporal lobes. But here you don't get the occipital lobe here. Instead, what you get here is the cerebellum. Okay, so you get the cerebellum inside this one, as you can see here, cerebellum. Okay, inside the posterior cranial fossa. Now we said the cerebrum is separated from the cerebellum by what is called tentorium cerebelli, extension of durameter. So that extension actually is attached to this line here. Okay. So this is the petrous temporal bone, you know that, petrous part of the temporal bone. So this is attached to a line like this. So that is attached here. Okay. So your tentorium cerebelli is like this. Okay. Here you get an opening in the tentorium cerebelli like this for the brain stem to pass, midbrain to pass through this opening. Otherwise, it just cannot go down into the foramen magnum. Now, this tentorium cerebelli actually separates the brain, the cerebrum in that area. The occipital lobe is sitting on this area. Occipital lobe is sitting on the tentorium cerebelli. Occipital lobe is there. Below that, in the posterior cranial fossa, you get the cerebellum. I think it's clear to you now. So remember these points. Then main gyri. Now we discussed main sulci, the central sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, and the lateral sulcus. The main gyri are these. I'll show you. Now, if you look at the lateral surface of the brain, this is the lateral surface of the brain. You get in the middle, you get, I don't know whether, yeah. Here you get the, I'll take a different color. Here you get the central sulcus. You get the central sulcus. In front of the central sulcus, you get the precentral gyrus. And behind the central sulcus, you get the postcentral gyrus. Now, these two gyri are very important because the postcentral gyrus is the main motor area. So that is also called motor cortex. Okay. Precentral gyrus is also called motor cortex. And the postcentral gyrus is the main sensory area. Okay. So it can be also called sensory cortex, therefore. Okay, motor cortex and sensory cortex. Then you can see, now this is the frontal lobe. This is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is divided into a superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. Then the temporal lobe is also divided into superior, middle, and temporal gyri. Okay, so these are all important gyri that you need to know. Then on the medial surface, if you take a sagittal section, on the medial surface, you get the cingulate gyrus. So this is the cingulate gyrus, this area, cingulate gyrus. And if you remove this brain stem, if you cut this and remove, you will see this parahippocampal gyrus continuing like this very nicely. Okay, that is on the temporal lobe. Okay, now the cingulate gyrus is on both frontal, this is frontal, and this is parietal lobes. Okay, and the cingulate gyrus is just above the connection between the two cerebral hemispheres, which is called the corpus callosum. We'll discuss that later. Okay, just above that, you get the cingulate gyrus. Okay. Then the brain has assigned certain areas for certain functions, which are called functional areas of the brain. Okay. Now I already mentioned two important functional areas. We said in front of the central sulcus, you get the motor cortex or the motor area, primary motor area. There are different names that you can use. Okay. And behind that, so it's the motor area in front of the central sulcus. Behind that, you get the sensory area or sensory cortex. Okay, it's precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. Then behind the sensory area, you get what is called sensory speech area or Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. This sensory speech area, because what it means is that it gets sensory inputs for speech. Now, for you to talk, you need to hear and you need to see the other person, how the person is talking and whatever. So you need to get information from the visual area and the auditory area, hearing and vision inputs into this Wernicke's area in the parietal lobe. Partly it's close to the temporal lobe also. Okay, so it may be junction between the parietal and temporal lobes. Okay, it's the Wernicke's area or sensory speech area. Then there is an area in the inferior frontal gyrus, which is called the motor speech area or Broca area. Broca or Broca's area. Okay, that will send motor impulses to the muscles that you use to talk. Okay, so one thing is you need to get sensory inputs. Other thing is you need to execute the talking. Okay, so then there are connections between these two. I'll get back to it in a short while. Okay, then you have these other areas like you have the taste area here in the lower part of the central, the sensory area, and you get, more importantly, the auditory area in the superior temporal gyrus. This is superior temporal gyrus. You have the auditory area there. Then the visual area, even though it's drawn like this, the whole occipital lobe is colored here. Actually, what you get is inside this. Yeah. So this is your parieto-occipital sulcus. This is your calcarine sulcus. Okay. So the visual area is in the occipital lobe on either side of the calcarine sulcus. So part will go outside also. Okay. So it's rather, if the calcarine sulcus is here, it would be an area like this. So it's rather inside than the outside. Okay. Anyway, you can take it like this for the moment. Okay. So you get the visual area, auditory area, motor speech area, sensory speech area, taste, then primary motor and primary sensory areas. Okay. Then this concept of homunculus, you will, the physiology people will talk about the homunculus anyway. Now the homunculus is how the body is represented in the cerebral cortex. How the body is represented in the cerebral cortex. Now we mentioned about sensory area and a motor area. Okay, so this area and this area. Now actually it's they are referring to the representation of the body in these two areas, motor area and the sensory area. Okay, now the representation is actually upside down. Head here, feet on that side, and the upper limbs here. Okay, so here also it's the same thing. Okay, so this representation is called homunculus. Therefore, you have a sensory homunculus and a motor homunculus. So the motor homunculus is on the precentral gyrus in the motor cortex. Sensory homunculus is on the postcentral gyrus. And if you look at the diagram, you can see here, you can see the tongue and all here in the motor one, then the face and mouth and the large hand, and compared to the hand, you see the size of the whole lower limb is of the size of the hand itself. Okay, so hand is so large in the motor homunculus. Then when it comes to the sensory homunculus, rather than the tongue there, you get mainly the pharynx and tongue also is there. Then you get an area for the face rather than the mouth. Here the mouth is big. Okay, so because the sensory is not too much from the mouth, but the whole face. Okay, but when it comes to speech, it is mainly the mouth. Okay, and then here the hand is very big. Here the hand is fairly comparatively small, because when it comes to sensory, the hand is less important than motor, because you get a lot of motor functions in the hand. So then the lower limb is anyway a comparatively small area compared to the size of it. And the foot is actually represented not on the outside, but on the medial side, remaining in the motor or the sensory cortex. Okay, foot area is on the medial side in the fissure, related to the fissure. Okay, so this is called motor and sensory homunculus of the brain. Okay, remember this concept. Then about gray matter and white matter. Gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is actually gray. Okay, it's dark. That's why you call it gray matter. Then white matter, it appears white or pale in color. Now gray matter, the dark appearance is because you get cells there. And the white matter, the white appearance is because you get nerve fibers there. And why you get white appearance due to nerve fibers? Because nerve fibers are myelinated. Okay. Now in the peripheral nervous system, they are myelinated by Schwann cells. SCHWA. Okay. So you get Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system myelinating the nerve fibers. In the central nervous system, again, they are myelinated but not by Schwann cells. They are myelinated by oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes. Okay. So due to the myelination by oligodendrocytes, you get this whitish appearance here. Okay. Due to the cells, you get this gray appearance. So in the brain, the cerebral hemispheres, the gray matter or the cells lie outside. White matter or the fibers lie inside. Now the advantage of arranging like this is that since you have this sulci and gyri on the outer surface, it increases the surface area. So you get a lot of surface area for the cells to get distributed. Okay. If the cells were inside, the distribution will be very much limited. Okay. So from all the cells, the fibers that are originating will come down into the center like this. Okay. Then we'll go down into the spinal cord. And when it comes to the spinal cord, it's the opposite. The opposite. Gray matter lies inside the spinal cord. White matter lies outside the outside in the spinal cord. Again, it makes sense because when the spinal cord goes up like this, okay, you get nerve fibers coming from the foot, leg, thighs, and trunk, and then from the upper limbs and all that. So if you had white matter in the middle here, in the middle, and the gray matter outside, these fibers will have to cross gray matter and enter the white matter to go up. And say millions and millions of fibers entering from bottom to top. And you know, when they go between these cells, they have to have space to go in between cells. Millions of fibers crossing through these cells will increase the spinal cord size, massively increase the size of the spinal cord, which you cannot afford to, okay, because you have to keep it as small as possible. So what has happened is the cells have been arranged inside, and the fibers, whatever the fibers that come, usually the fibers that are coming, say if you have a nerve tract like this, fibers coming from the lower limb and the foot, they will go to the deepest part, you know, if they don't cross to the opposite side and go up. Then the fibers entering from the trunk and the upper limbs, they enter like that and go up without even crossing each other. Otherwise, if a fiber goes like that, another one goes like that, there will be a crossing, which will increase the size. It's like, you know, having fingers like this or having fingers like that. So that doubles the width. Okay. So when you understand the nerve tracts also, you will realize this. Okay. So remember this point. So most of the biological things, they have a reason behind. Okay. Then the gray matter, where the cells are, is arranged into 6 cortical layers. Okay, just remember the number if you want, not the details. Okay, it's arranged into 6 cortical layers. In these layers, 6 cortical layers, there are 5 types of cells. Again, you don't have to remember the names of the layers or the cells. Okay, it is for psychiatrists and people like that who handle these functions of these cells in patients, psychiatric patients and all, okay, or neurologists, okay. So all these names you don't have to remember except for one name, this one, okay, pyramidal cells, because these pyramidal cells, they are important motor cells, they are like pyramids, okay. So cells in the motor cortex, primary motor area, not all of them are pyramidal cells, but you get large pyramidal cells starting from that area. Different name is also given. It's bed cells. Okay, those pyramidal cells are called bed cells or something. But you can forget the details, but remember the pyramidal cells are motor cells, and there are many pyramidal cells in the motor cortex. Okay. Anyway, we'll revisit these things later. So this is how you can draw the 6 layers of the brain with all their names, okay, which you don't have to remember, and the cells, how they're arranged. Okay, that's it. Okay, don't go behind it too much. Then about the white matter, now we discussed the gray matter. White matter, we already said it's composed of myelinated nerve fibers in the central nervous system. It's the oligodendrocytes that myelinate the nerve fibers. So they're supported by oligodendroglia, which are called neuroglia in this case, astrocytes and oligodendrocytes. Then white matter can be classified in the brain. Brain white matter can be classified into 3 important groups. Okay, so you can have commissural fibers, you can have association fibers, and you can have projection fibers. Okay, commissural, association, and projection fibers. Now the function of commissural fibers is to connect the 2 cerebral hemispheres. Now you have one cerebral hemisphere like this, then you have another cerebral hemisphere like this. 2 sides are connected by commissural fiber tracts. These are white matter, okay, nerve fibers. Now one important commissural fiber tract is the corpus, the corpus callosum that we just described, okay, which is like this, okay, which is the corpus callosum, one important commissural fiber tract. Then there's another important commissural fiber tract, something like this. It's actually, you don't have to draw it here, it's actually related to the corpus callosum. It's related to the corpus callosum like this, okay. This is exactly the placement of it. That is called fornix. That also connects the 2 sides. Then you have very small connections, anterior and posterior commissures. I'll show you them when I get the images. Okay. So there are at least 4 important commissural fiber tracts connecting the 2 cerebral hemispheres. Now, the largest one is the corpus callosum. Okay. So therefore, it can be divided into several parts, corpus callosum. So the most posterior part is called, that is this part, is called the splenium. And this here, it's the body. Then this area is called genu. Genu is a bend. Okay. So genu can be found in different places. Okay. It's a common term, not specific for the corpus callosum. Okay. You will see genus in other places, several other places. So it's a bend. Okay. And then below the bend, you get the rostrum. That area is the rostrum. Okay. So remember these four parts: splenium, body, genu, and the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Okay. Then this is the fornix that I referred to. Fornix. Okay. Fornix is here. This is the other part that connects the two sides. And your anterior commissure is this one actually. Okay. It's a very small area. And your posterior commissure is here. It's very small. Okay. Here and here. Anterior and posterior commissures. Okay. Extremely small areas. Okay. Then this association fibers, second category of white matter. Association for now, the commissural fibers, they connect the two sides, two cerebral hemispheres. Now, association fibers, if you take one cerebral hemisphere like this, association fibers will connect areas in the same cerebral hemisphere, two areas in the same cerebral hemisphere. Okay. So one good example is, now we discussed about this motor sensory area and motor speech area, Broca area and Wernicke's area. Now, for optimal functioning, before you talk, you need to know what the other person talked about. Okay. Otherwise, it will be a mallepol kata. Okay. So then these two areas has to be connected. Okay. So there is a named association fiber tract connecting the Wernicke's area to the Broca area, which is called arcuate fasciculus. Okay. This is called arcuate fasciculus. Okay, that's the name of it. But remember that it's an association fiber tract. Okay, one of the important ones. Actually, people get diseases of this. Okay, this due to blood supply or whatever. This gets disrupted. Then you can understand what will happen to the person's speech. He will have very fluent, very good speech, but it's not relevant to the topic when the other person is talking about. That's why I said malleable. Okay, it's exactly true. So there is a problem with the association fiber tract, arcuate fasciculus. But then that's a long association fiber tract, okay, that connects the Wernicke's to the Broca area. Then there are short association fiber tracts. Now, this is how you understand it. You have this sulci and gyri. If you get adjacent gyri, now this is one gyrus, there's another gyrus. Short association fiber tracts actually connect adjacent gyri. And the function is that connecting the adjacent gyri to each other. Okay. Then projection fibers. Third category of white matter is the projection fibers. It's both afferent. Afferent means sensory. Efferent means motor. Sensory and motor fibers passing between the brain stem, that is midbrain pons medulla, and the cerebral cortex. Now again, if I draw it, you have the cerebrum like that, then you have the midbrain pons medulla. So connections between the brain and the brain stem, the cerebrum and the brain stem, they are projection fibers. So why you call them projection? They go beyond the limits of the cerebrum, beyond the limits of the cerebrum, and come down to the brain stem. And they actually continue down into the spinal cord as well. Okay, by the definition is this one. Okay. So good examples of projection fiber tracts are the internal capsule, corona radiata, and optic radiation. So we will discuss what these things are in a moment. Okay. Okay, so this is it. So then corona radiata and the internal capsule, now what happens is all your nerve fiber tracts, fibers going up, which are the sensory fibers, and the fibers going down from the brain, the cerebral cortex, which are the motor fibers, they will all have to enter the spinal cord or the cranial nerves. Then, even though they start from the whole the cerebrum, the cerebral hemisphere, they will have to ultimately go through a very small area in the brain. Okay, so which is called the internal capsule. Okay, so this area is called the internal capsule. It's a very small area, narrow area. Then even though it passes through a narrow area and continues down here into the spinal cord through the brain stem, when it comes to the cerebral hemisphere, which is very large, this will fan out like this, radiate out. Okay, radiate out both in the anterior-posterior direction and across left to right direction. Okay, both directions. Now, this radiation is called corona radiata because it radiates. Okay, so these are all examples for projection fibers. Okay, so internal capsule, corona radiata, and the posterior limit of the corona radiata is called optic radiation and auditory radiation or whatever it is. Okay. So there's another example of what the internal capsule is. So you get so this is internal capsule. Okay. So you get your thalamus in black here, and this is nucleus, basal ganglion. We'll get back to it, called lentiform nucleus. So between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus, you get the internal capsule fibers. Okay, coming out. Okay, I'll show you. This is not a very good diagram, I think, for that purpose. Okay. So that is the corona, the internal capsule and the corona radiata, radiating from it. Okay. So few things about basal ganglia. I'll come back to the internal capsule later again. Okay. And now the concept of basal ganglia. Now you get the gray matter in the cortex. Then you get white matter inside. Now embedded in white matter, you can have cells. Again, when there are cells, you see them as gray matter. So it's like gray matter inside the white matter. Okay. So these cells, which are arranged in groups or clusters, large areas of clusters inside the white matter, are called basal ganglia. Okay. So basal ganglia are extremely important for the functioning of the brain. There are several basal ganglia, we'll see, but they are. So the main basal ganglia are the corpus striatum, amygdaloid, and claustrum. Corpus striatum, amygdaloid, and claustrum. Corpus striatum has two important parts, the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. And the lentiform nucleus actually has two further divisions, the putamen and the globus pallidus. So in fact, there are several of them. Okay. I'll show you diagrams so that you will understand it. Now here in this diagram, this is the horizontal section of the brain. This is the horizontal section of the brain. It's cut like this. Okay, it's a horizontal section. In this horizontal section, now this whole thing is the lentiform nucleus. Okay, this whole thing is the lentiform nucleus. Okay, then you get the putamen. This is putamen, and this is globus pallidus. This is globus pallidus. This is putamen. So this is this one, putamen and globus pallidus. Then this is the caudate nucleus. This is only the head of the caudate nucleus. That is this part, head of the caudate nucleus. Since it has a body and a tail. Okay, so it's a very three-dimensional structure. So when you take a section like this, which is this one, okay, you will only cut through the head here. You will not cut through the body because it's at a higher level. You might be able to cut at the tail somewhere here, which you can't recognize. Okay, so it's the head that you see clearly in that appearance. But the point here is, now here then you know the lentiform nucleus now. Then you know the head of the caudate. Caudate, this is lentiform nucleus with its two parts, putamen and globus pallidus. Now this is your thalamus. The two thalami on either side. Okay, so you have the head of the caudate, lentiform, and thalamus medially. Now this is internal capsule. This area is your internal capsule. It's a very narrow area. Okay, so in that also you have a gynu here. Okay, can you see the gynu? There's a bend here. So, if you take that as the internal capsule, then the thalamus and head of the caudate lies medial to the internal capsule. Lentiform nucleus lies lateral to it. Okay. Now, in this example, your internal capsule passes through this area. Okay. So, medial to it, you get the thalamus and the head of the caudate here on the other side, and lateral to it, you get the lentiform nucleus. Okay, I don't know whether you understood it. Okay. So at least several basal ganglia were seen there. The lentiform with its two parts and the caudate nucleus. Now the claustrum is this one. Claustrum is this one. Can you see a very faint line-like gray matter? That is claustrum. Okay. And the area between the claustrum and the lentiform nucleus, this area is called external capsule, which is not very important like the internal capsule. Okay. So this diagram is an enlarged view, so things are clear. So your internal capsule here, this whole thing, your lentiform nucleus, caudate nucleus, your thalamus, and then this is your claustrum, and this is your external capsule. Okay. And this cortex, this area of cortex, if you put your finger through your lateral sulcus, you will end up on this cortex. It's called insular cortex. Nothing to do with the basal ganglia, it's insular cortex. Okay. So if you enlarge this area shown with the square, this is how you see it. Okay. You enlarge it, this is how you see it. So you have the lentiform nucleus, you have the putamen outside and the globus pallidus inside. Then you have the internal capsule, and you get the thalamus here. Okay, and the head of the caudate. The same thing I have drawn here. Okay. Then in relation to the head of the caudate nucleus, you see these ventricles. I'll get back to it later, not now. So in this diagram, for the sake of completeness, I have drawn part of the tail of the caudate also. Okay. Because I said when you cut like this, you will cut through the part of the tail also, somewhere behind. Okay. So this is the tail. Okay, then this claustrum and external capsule, which I showed you. Okay. So this is another basal ganglion, claustrum. Then, even though we are not discussing the internal capsule, a small point about the internal capsule, which you will anyway revisit, it contains many fiber tracts, nerve fiber tracts. Now, you can see this corticobulbar, corticospinal. So these are all important motor tracts. And then these thalamocortical ones are actually the main sensory nerve tracts going upwards. Okay. So this is called the anterior limb of the internal capsule, and this area is called genu of the internal capsule, and then this area is called the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So then you should get some idea about the internal capsule and the fiber tracts in the internal capsule. Okay. But I will not discuss it totally here. It will be discussed later, maybe with the nerve tracts and all. Then some authors of books, they include another basal ganglion, okay, which is the substantia nigra. Okay, substantia nigra, and there are what are called subthalamic nuclei in the diencephalon. Okay, so the substantia nigra is actually not in the cerebrum. This, of course, is in the cerebrum. Substantia nigra is actually in the midbrain. Okay, in the brain stem. Okay, when we do the brain stem, you will see the substantia nigra again. So if the midbrain is like this, it extends in its whole length. Okay, substantia nigra. Whether you cut it here, here, or here, at which level you get the substantia nigra. Then now we discussed mainly the cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres. Then about the diencephalon, diencephalon consists of mainly the thalamus and hypothalamus, as I said. Then there are two additional parts, small parts, the subthalamus and the epithalamus. Now, epithalamus is the one that contains the pineal gland. Pineal gland. At a time, we thought during a period of time, we thought pineal gland is not an important gland, but now it seems that it's an important gland because it maintains the circadian rhythm. Night and day-night rhythm is maintained by the pineal gland. So when you travel long distance to a place like US in an aircraft, you get this jet lag, time lag. That is mainly due to pineal gland. Okay, because the long trip mixes up your day-night cycle. Okay, now this is an enlarged view of the sagittal section of the brain. Now, if you take a sagittal section of the brain, take the sagittal section of the brain like this, you cut this in the middle, you get this section which you have seen before. If you enlarge this sagittal section, now you see this corpus callosum here, which you have studied before, corpus callosum, okay, with all its parts, splenium, body, genu, and the frustum. And this is your fornix. This is your fornix, okay. And between the fornix and the corpus callosum, you have this thin membrane which is called the septum pellucidum. We will learn that later. Now the focus here is the diencephalon. Okay, diencephalon is this area. This is the area of the diencephalon. Okay. Now the diencephalon. Okay, if I further enlarge this, this is how you see it. Now the diencephalon above is the thalamus. So this area is the thalamus, and this area is the hypothalamus. To the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland is attached to the pituitary stalk, which is shown here, pituitary stalk. Then behind the thalamus, you get this epithalamus and subthalamus. Now epithalamus, as you can see here, is the area for the pineal gland. Here you get your pineal gland here. Okay. And here is your anterior commissure. Here is your posterior commissure, the commissural tracts that I showed before. Now, between the two thalami on either side, you get a connection. They are connected. So that is called interthalamic connection. That is called interthalamic connection. Okay, that is called interthalamic connection. Now, this is how you can draw it. Okay. Again, if you take a coronal section, if you take a section like this, this is how you see it. You get two thalami above and the two hypothalami below. Okay. Connected to the pituitary gland here below. Then lateral to the thalami, you get the internal capsule here. And further laterally, you get the lentiform nucleus, which you don't see in this diagram. Okay, it's on the other side. Okay. Okay. Then above that, you get the fornix. So that is this area. If I cut like this here, you cut the fornix here. This is fornix. Okay. So above the thalamus, you get the fornix. Above the thalamus, you get the fornix. Then between the two thalami, here, there's a cavity in that area, okay, which is a ventricular cavity. So that is the third ventricle that you get there. Okay, we'll revisit it. So the interthalamic connection actually passes through the third ventricle. Now the thalamus, you don't have to know details about the thalamus, but thalamus is one of the most important areas because it's an important cell station. It's a very important cell station. So especially the sensory nerve tracts, okay, that are coming up, except the olfactory tract, all other nerve pathways, your auditory, visual, and all other general pathways, pain, temperature, touch, all that will have a relay in the thalamus. So they relay in the thalamus. If the thalamus is like this, these sensory tracts come into the thalamus, then a new nerve fiber starts from the thalamus. So this is a relay. Okay. So because of this lot of relays, you get a lot of nuclei. Nuclei are collections of cell bodies. Wherever you get a nucleus, that is a collection of cell bodies in the thalamus. And the other important thing is the thalamus integrates visceral and somatic functions. Okay. So this is a diagram of the thalamus actually. You see, there are many. If you label them, can you see the list? Long list of nuclei in the thalamus. You don't have to remember the names of all these nuclei. Okay. So these are the two sides, left and right sides of the thalamus with the interthalamic connection. So this area is actually the third ventricle area in between. But all these names, just take a look at them. Number of nuclei you get. So this is another diagram to show that from smell, I think these are all different nuclei, cell stations in the thalamus. In the hypothalamus, the one below the thalamus, it's almost all physiological activities of the body are influenced by the hypothalamus. So integration of autonomic functions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic functions, regulation of hormonal functions, maintaining body homeostasis, regulation of body temperature and fluids, sexual behavior, emotion, drive to eat and drink, all controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay. Then again, in the hypothalamus, you get two important cell groups, the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. You will learn these things in physiology. I'm not going into the details of that. Okay, so anyway, you will learn these things when you do the endocrine system. So there are secretions from some of these nuclei, and they are taken through this hypothalamus-hypophysioportal system into the anterior pituitary. So you have the hypothalamus like this, you have the pituitary stalk, you get the anterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary is another one. Okay, so something like this. Okay, sorry. Okay. So you get the connection is to the posterior pituitary, you get the anterior pituitary. Through blood vessels, you get the hormones coming into the anterior pituitary. Okay. So this is then thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay. In the pineal gland, I already mentioned it produces a hormone called melatonin, which maintains the circadian rhythm influenced by light, day and night cycles. Okay. And it indirectly controls the functions of other endocrine organs, even including the pituitary. Even though we think the pituitary, the hypothalamus is the highest, pineal gland, the pituitary is the highest, sorry. Even the pineal gland has a control over pituitary gland through circadian rhythm maintenance. Okay, then the ventricular system of the brain. This is how you understand the ventricular system of the brain. Now, if you look from the side, this is how you see it, this one. And if you look from above, this is your eye, this is how you see it. This is from the side. Okay. Then, now this is called lateral ventricle. This is inside the cerebral hemisphere. Okay. So if I draw it, this is the lateral ventricle. This whole thing is the lateral ventricle. So it has an anterior horn, it has a body, a posterior horn, and an inferior horn. Okay. Anterior horn, body, posterior horn, and inferior horn. Anterior, posterior, inferior horns. Okay. So this one, anterior horn and anterior part of the body lies in the frontal lobe. Okay, so that is this part, lies in the frontal lobe. Then the posterior part of the body lies in the parietal lobe, that is this part. Posterior horn goes into the occipital lobe. Okay, your occipital lobe is here. And the inferior horn goes into the temporal lobe. Okay, so if I draw the brain here in relation to this one, if I draw the brain in relation to this one, I'll take a different color. So this is how I can draw the brain. Like this. Okay. So frontal lobe here, parietal lobe, then the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is how it is distributed into the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Then this part, this is the third ventricle. So these are called lateral ventricles, left and right lateral ventricles, left and right lateral ventricles. Then this part below the lateral ventricles and in the center, this one is in the center here. It is in the center between the two. That is called the third ventricle. Now you have 1 and 2 here. No? Which side is 1, which side is 2? No one knows. Okay. So 1 and 2 are here. The third, this is the third ventricle. Therefore. Okay. Now that one lies between the two thalami. Now we said the one thalamus is like this, another thalamus is like that, and you get the interthalamic connection. This area is the third ventricle. Okay. That is the third ventricle. Then this one is the fourth ventricle in the brain stem. It's in the pons and medulla. Okay, fourth ventricle. There's a connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle through the midbrain, which is called the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. Then there are connections between the other areas also. Now, if you take the two ventricles, there's a connection between the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle here. It's like this. You get the two lateral ventricles here. Connection is like this. You get a connection between the two, and the same connects with the third one. So it's a three-way connection, like, okay. So it's three-way connection. If I go back to one, okay. That connection is through here. So this is foramen of Monro. Foramen of Monro that connects the two lateral ventricles. Now, one lateral ventricle is on the other side of this septum pellucidum. So this side lateral ventricle is on this side of it. Okay, so one is on this side, other one is on the other side. I can't show it here. And this is the third ventricle in the thalamus area, hypothalamus area. So this foramen of Monro connects the two lateral ventricles as well as the third ventricle. This is your cerebral aqueduct, connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle here. Third to fourth. Okay, so this is the area of the midbrain. Cerebral aqueduct passes through the midbrain. Okay, so this is about the ventricles. Now, when you put your caudate nucleus, the head of the caudate nucleus comes to lie somewhere here. Okay, and the body comes like this, and actually it continues with the very much similar to the lateral ventricle, like this body and the tail. Okay. So that's why in some of the diagrams, you know, when we cut it in the horizontal plane, you had the head of the caudate, then you had the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles like this. Okay. Head of the caudate here. Now these ventricles, they are filled with the fluid, which is called cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, they are filled with a fluid, which is called the cerebrospinal fluid. Now this cerebrospinal fluid is inside these cavities. Okay, now they are secreted into these cavities through structures called choroid plexus. Okay, so this is the formation of cerebrospinal fluid. This is choroid plexus. Okay, now the choroid plexus is formed by, now these are ependymal cells. These are ependymal cells. We said if there's a cavity, inner lining is by the ependymal cells. Okay, now this is a blood vessel. This is a blood vessel with its endothelium here. Endothelium. And with the endothelium of the blood vessel together with the ependymal layer of cells forms the choroid plexus that secrete the CSF into the ventricles. Now, once it enters the ventricles, these are the ventricles, you can see this is the choroid plexus. So the CSF is secreted in the ventricles, then they get absorbed, then they get released. They get released into the gap between the, now you have the dura mater like this, you have the arachnoid mater, then you have the pia mater. Now this space between the pia mater and arachnoid mater of the brain and spinal cord is called subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space. Now this CSF inside the cavities is released through certain places into the subarachnoid space. Okay, into the subarachnoid space. Now this is the the ventricular system, the lateral ventricles, the connection, foramen of Mond, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. Okay. Now, the fluid in this ventricular system comes out through what are called foramina of Luschka and Magendie. Okay. In relation to the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle in the brainstem. Now they fill the subarachnoid space. Now this is the subarachnoid space here. Then they fill the subarachnoid space which surrounds the brain and the spinal cord for protection. Okay. So CSF is in here and also in the subarachnoid space. And they get absorbed back into the circulation, blood circulation, venous system at the top here. In relation to your falx cerebri, in the longitudinal fissure, there are structures called arachnoid granulations. Okay, these are called arachnoid granulations. Can you see? Okay, so this is subarachnoid space. CSF is this is venous blood into a vein that is called superior sagittal sinus. There you will learn it. So what happens is the arachnoid mater, if arachnoid mater is like that, that will project into the dural venous sinus. Now this is a venous sinus here, and CSF will get absorbed into the venous blood through the arachnoid granulation. So this is a close view of the arachnoid granulation. You get the brain here substance, you get the subarachnoid space filled with CSF there. Okay, and this is an arachnoid granulation inside the superior sagittal sinus, venous, superior sagittal sinus. So this gets CSF reabsorbed into the bloodstream, and they are formed at the choroid plexus and absorbed at the arachnoid granulations.